But there is also a lot of things in addition to finance that can be done on adaptation, and both in terms of cooperative action and also in terms of mechanisms. And I think a particularly promising area there are things that can be done in the risk domain. And be it insurance, be it ways to share risk and to actually reduce vulnerability directly. And here I'm talking about economic vulnerability. And so I think there are some real serious things that Copenhagen can put in place. And similar to what I said earlier about the clean development mechanism, we do not need to work out the details of an insurance scheme in Copenhagen, but there needs to be a clarity that that's going to be part of the solution. Finally, David, I read coming here the introduction to the human impact report, which I very much welcome, putting a human face on this problem. I think that's critically important, and I applaud the authors to try the impossible, but I think it has to be done. And what scared me was his reference to Copenhagen need to be the most ambitious international agreement ever negotiated. And so that's kind of a daunting, and the reason I'm bringing that up, I think it is important to think a bit about what is ambitious. How do you measure ambition? And I think one of the things to avoid here, and this I'm sure any reporter hates this kind of statement, but I'll still make it, is that you cannot reduce ambition down to a headline or a number. And I think the emission reduction numbers coming out of, in terms of commitments, they will disappoint. Let's be ready for that. They will disappoint. But what is more important is that there is a firm commitment for the governments, all the governments of the world, to move forward together, and not giving them an option to walk away from the deal, like was the case in Kyoto, or after Kyoto. Thank you.
Halldor, thank you very much indeed. That's a shot across the media's bows at this early stage in the thing. Let's move on straight away to Paul. Set out your stall.
So I'm a little bit of a voice of skepticism and pessimism here. I don't think we're going to get anything close in Copenhagen to what is actually necessary to solve the problem or begin to solve the problem. Globally, it would be fine if emissions peaked next year and dropped at 5% annually. That would give us a reasonable chance, like maybe an 80% chance of staying below the 2-degree threshold, which is by itself no means safe. So what we need to do from a, scientific perspective, I use the term a little bit loosely because this is not a narrowly scientific problem. It's a question of what risks do you want to take with the planet? There is nothing we could possibly do that would be too soon or too fast, and we're simply nowhere near that. The numbers are going to be disappointing. The politics of North and South is still completely deadlocked. The United States, after 8 years of dark ages, has finally turned on the light, but there's nowhere near the political support in the United States for the kind of treaty that would actually be necessary. You could easily find yourself in the same situation where, under bad circumstances, the Obama administration negotiated a treaty that it could not get ratified. Given that, what's a world to do? The first thing I want to say is that in the long run, I'm an optimist. I've been a co-developer with some of my colleagues and with funding from a gentleman in the back here who's been one of our supporters, Jörg, when he was at the Heinrich Böll Foundation. We've actually developed a climate architecture for what we refer to as an emergency program. It's based on assigning obligations to countries based on their responsibility and capacity, that is to say their responsibility for past emissions and their capacity, basically meaning their income or wealth. It does it in such a way that it looks within countries so that the rich people in poor countries have equivalent obligations to the rich people in rich countries. And it does away with the Annex 1, non-Annex 1 distinction. So even the poorest countries have obligations that are proportional to the wealth and capacity and responsibility that they actually have. So I'm a firm believer in idealism and optimism, but the world is not ready for this yet. Copenhagen is not ready for this yet. The Annex I countries have basically failed to deliver everything they said they were going to deliver starting in Rio, and not only in the climate talks, but essentially across the entire regime of international negotiations, the trade negotiations, the current resolution, the global financial crisis. Nothing that's been done in the last 2 decades has made the developing countries feel that they should trust the Annex I, the developed countries, to do anything on the scale of what they said they were going to do. And yet we find ourselves in a situation where what we really need to do is negotiate some kind of, I'm going to use an old-fashioned term here, new international economic order. And that's not going to happen in Copenhagen. It's not going to happen 2 years after Copenhagen. It might happen in a decade. So what can we hope for that will make progress? It would be a good start if the Annex I countries actually agreed to reasonably steep targets, but they're not going to come close to what is, quote-unquote, scientifically necessary. It would be good if they agreed to put a pot of money on the table for adaptation and mitigation in developing countries, but what you will see will be almost certainly fall very far short of even the relatively modest sums of $150 or $160 billion that you see thrown around, which seems like big amounts in terms of international aid flows. I mean, international private capital flows are substantially larger than that, but they're all designed with the intention that they bring profits back home. And these kinds of investments are not expected to be profitable in the ordinary sense. Certainly, governments are trying to enable these reductions, these investments to be profitable, but if they were, they would be done already. That's the theory in any case. So where does that leave us? Reduced expectations. I think within 5 years we can do much better than we can now. I think the hope that even, I mean, to be blunt, there is no shared long-term vision right now. So trying to negotiate one that will have some kind of binding consequences is likely not to be very productive. The question is, what's the minimum interim agreement you can do so you can make some progress in 2, 4, 5 years out to 2015 or 2017, so that you have time to actually build some trust, so that you can actually take the kinds of fairly dramatic steps that are necessary. And it's the case if you, there is a schizophrenia, because part of me and part of everyone believes that if only we did some relatively modest things like put a price on carbon and invested money in the right ways, we could really almost solve this problem with fairly modest changes. And then there's another part of me and part of most organizations that says we really need to dramatically organize the whole world. And we all have to change our lifestyles, and we have to change our technology and our systems and our international cooperation. And most of us can't see how we're going to get there, so we hope that we can do this with fairly marginal changes. I don't actually believe, when I sort of think through the problem intellectually, that that's true. And the question of, how you hear even relatively serious people like John Ash, the British, I'm not going to get his title. Ashton, thank you. He was I'm not going to get his title correctly, but he was a special advisor. He said at the recent scientific conference in Copenhagen, the kind of changes we need are usually only seen in the conditions of mobilization for war. And, we're not exactly in that mental state right now when it comes to climate change. So getting from here to there is a bit of a challenge. We all have a messaging problem that we don't quite know how to deal with between optimism and panic. And I think we just have to, again, take it one step at a time. And, by and large, what will come out of Copenhagen is an agreement to keep talking about the implementation details. I'm worried that even some of the very basics, like what will be the governance of a fund for investing in mitigation, I doubt that even that very high level can be agreed right now because of the disagreements between North and South. So with that, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will.
Thank you very much. Well, we've come to the point where I'll throw this open to your questions and comments. There is a roving microphone, so just those who want to ask a question or make an observation, stick your hand in the air and I'll make sure the mic comes towards you. While you just think of your questions, I'd like to put one, if I may, to the panel. Halldor, you talked about the need for clarity out of Copenhagen. I don't think it's just the media, it will be the public who will think that the only clarity that counts is numbers. And people like myself will refer back in our reports to Kyoto and its 5.2 reduction target, and we'll compare what Copenhagen achieves. I mean, in that context, how do you read the way things may be going?